The polished marble floors of the Meridian Executive Protection Academy reflected the afternoon, sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting geometric patterns across the training facility where Maria Santos stood motionless among 30 other recruits. At 5 feet 4 inches with delicate features and hands that had never seen calluses, she appeared as out of place as a butterfly in a den of wolves. The other candidates towered over her with military backgrounds etched into their postures, their conversations peppered with tactical jargon and war stories that seemed to bounce off her like rain on glass. When Instructor Kane announced the first physical assessment, the snickers that rippled through the group were barely concealed, and Maria's calm expression never wavered even as whispers of somebody's lost and wrong career fair sweetheart drifted toward her like smoke. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Meridian Executive Protection Academy occupied 12 acres of pristine training grounds in the Virginia countryside, its reputation built on producing the world's most elite bodyguards for heads of state, corporate executives, and celebrities who required the highest level of personal security. The facility's imposing structure resembled a modern fortress, with reinforced concrete walls disguised as elegant architecture and surveillance systems so advanced they could track a hummingbird's flight pattern. Students paid upwards of $50,000 for the intensive 12-week program, and the dropout rate exceeded 70% within the first month alone. Maria had arrived 3 days earlier with a single suitcase and paperwork that raised more questions than it answered. Her application listed previous employment as administrative assistant and retail coordinator, entries that seemed laughably inadequate for someone seeking to protect high-value targets from armed assassins and international criminals. The psychological evaluation noted her as quiet but observant, with above-average stress tolerance, hardly the psychological profile that screamed future Secret Service material. Instructor Kane, a former Navy SEAL whose scarred hands told stories of classified operations across 3 continents, had initially assumed Maria's enrollment was either a mistake or a publicity stunt orchestrated by someone with more money than sense. His weathered face carried the permanent squint of someone who had learned to assess threats in milliseconds, and his first assessment of Maria Santos was that she would be washing out before the weekend arrived. The Academy's daily routine began at 5 in the morning with conditioning exercises that would challenge professional athletes. Students were expected to complete obstacle courses designed by former Special Forces personnel, engage in hand-to-hand combat scenarios against opponents who showed no mercy for size or gender differences, and demonstrate proficiency with weapon systems that ranged from concealed pistols to exotic defensive tools that most people had never heard of. Maria's first week became a masterclass in systematic humiliation that seemed almost choreographed in its precision. During firearms training, her small hands struggled with the Academy's standard-issue pistols, and her shots consistently landed outside the acceptable accuracy zones, while her classmates achieved tight groupings that would make marksmen jealous. The combat conditioning sessions left her gasping for air while former Marines and police officers completed the same exercises with energy to spare for casual conversation about weekend plans. But it was during the practical protection scenarios where Maria's apparent inadequacy became most glaring. The Academy's training exercises simulated real-world situations where bodyguards had to shield clients from everything from paparazzi, ambush to coordinated terrorist attacks, and Maria's responses seemed to follow patterns that made no tactical sense to her instructors or fellow students. When faced with simulated gunfire, she would move in directions that appeared counterintuitive, seeking cover behind positions that seemed less secure than obvious alternatives. During evacuation drills, her route choices often led through areas that other students avoided, and her timing seemed off by crucial seconds that could mean the difference between life and death in actual emergencies. What none of them recognized was that Maria's movements followed protocols that were classified far above the security clearances of anyone at the academy. Her training had come from institutions that didn't appear on any public records, and her instincts had been honed in situations where failure meant consequences that extended far beyond personal embarrassment. The breaking point arrived during the third week when Instructor Kane decided to pair Maria with Derek Thornton, a 6'3" former Army Ranger whose muscular frame and aggressive demeanor had earned him the nickname, the Steamroller, among his fellow recruits. Thornton's background included 3 tours in Afghanistan and specialized training in close quarters, combat that had saved his life on multiple occasions when conventional tactics had failed. Kane's intention was straightforward and brutal in its simplicity. He wanted to demonstrate to Maria that executive protection was not a career field where good intentions and enthusiasm could substitute for physical capability and tactical expertise. The exercise was designed as a standard hostage rescue scenario, where Thornton would play the role of an armed kidnapper holding a client, and Maria would be responsible for neutralizing the threat and securing the victim's safety. The training facility's mock apartment had been configured to replicate a luxury hotel suite, complete with furniture that could serve as cover, multiple entry points that required tactical consideration, and lighting conditions that mimicked the challenges bodyguards faced in real-world situations. Hidden cameras would record every moment of the exercise for later analysis, though Kane suspected the footage would serve primarily as documentation of Maria's final failure before her inevitable departure from the program. As the exercise commenced, Thornton positioned himself in the mock suite's bedroom with a training mannequin representing the kidnapped client, while Maria received her briefing in the hallway outside. The scenario parameters were deliberately challenging. Thornton was armed with a training pistol loaded with marking rounds that would leave visible evidence of successful hits, and he had been instructed to show no mercy in his role as the kidnapper. Maria entered the suite with movements that seemed hesitant and uncertain, her small frame appearing even more vulnerable in the tactical gear that had been sized for larger students. She cleared the living room area using techniques that looked textbook correct, but lacked the fluid confidence that characterized competent operators, and her weapon handling seemed mechanical rather than intuitive. What happened next would be analyzed and debated by Academy instructors for years to come, though the official records of the exercise would eventually be sealed and classified at levels that exceeded the Academy's normal documentation procedures. As Maria approached the bedroom where Thornton waited with his hostage, her movements underwent a transformation so subtle that most observers initially missed its significance. The hesitant steps became purposeful glides across the floor that made no sound against the hardwood surface. Her weapon handling shifted from mechanical precision to flowing efficiency that seemed to anticipate targets before they appeared. Most remarkably, her tactical awareness expanded to encompass angles and possibilities that weren't taught in any standard protection manual. Thornton, expecting to face an overwhelmed amateur, instead found himself confronting someone whose responses operated on levels that challenged his considerable combat experience. Maria's entry into the bedroom was not the predictable frontal approach that her earlier performance had suggested, but rather a coordinated sequence of movements that seemed to account for variables that weren't visible to casual observation. The confrontation lasted exactly 17 seconds, though the complexity of what occurred in that time frame would require hours of slow-motion analysis to fully comprehend. Maria's approach neutralized Thornton's positional advantage, secured the hostage's safety, and concluded with the former Army Ranger flat on his back with Maria's training weapon pressed against his temple in a position that would have been instantly fatal in actual combat. The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable, broken only by Thornton's labored breathing as he processed what had just occurred. His combat experience included engagements against trained insurgents and professional soldiers, but he had never been outmaneuvered with such complete efficiency by someone who appeared to have learned tactical skills from instruction manuals. rather than battlefield experience. Kane's reaction was more complex than simple surprise. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. His years of training elite operators had taught him to recognize the subtle indicators that separated genuine experts from enthusiastic amateurs, and Maria's performance contained elements that suggested training at levels that exceeded the Academy's standard curriculum. The fluidity of her movements, the tactical choices that seemed to anticipate her opponent's responses, and most tellingly, the calm efficiency with which she had secured victory all pointed to experience that her personnel file didn't begin to explain. But the most unsettling aspect of Maria's performance was not its technical excellence, but rather the complete absence of emotion that characterized her victory. She had not celebrated her success, shown satisfaction at proving her doubters wrong, or even acknowledged the magnitude of what she had accomplished. Instead, she had simply helped Thornton to his feet with the same quiet courtesy she showed everyone, checked that the training mannequin had sustained no damage, and waited for further instructions with the patient stillness of someone accustomed to extraordinary situations. The days that followed brought a shift in academy dynamics that was both subtle and profound. Maria's classmates began paying closer attention to her techniques during training exercises, though most of them attributed her sudden improvement to natural adaptation rather than the revelation of carefully concealed expertise. Thornton himself became something of an unofficial mentor, offering tactical advice with the respect that warriors showed each other after testing their skills in honest competition. But Kane's suspicions had been aroused by inconsistencies that went beyond a simple case of late-blooming talent. Maria's personnel file, when subjected to more thorough examination, contained gaps and irregularities that suggested deliberate obfuscation rather than simple clerical errors. Her emergency contacts listed a single phone number that connected to an answering service rather than family members or friends, and her previous addresses followed patterns that seemed designed to obscure rather than document her actual residences. Most intriguingly, Maria's medical records contained notations that required security clearances to access, and her fingerprints had been flagged with restrictions that prevented routine background checks from accessing certain databases. These were not the typical complications associated with citizens who had held government positions or military service, but rather the specific markers used to protect the identities of individuals whose exposure could compromise ongoing operations. Kane's own background included connections that reached into the intelligence community's more classified corners, and he began making discreet inquiries through channels that operated outside normal administrative procedures. The responses he received were uniform in their evasiveness, but the pattern of non-answers suggested that Maria Santos was known to people who preferred her identity to remain unexamined. The transformation in Maria's public performance at the Academy was gradual but undeniable. Her firearms scores improved from barely acceptable to exceptional, though her technique suggested muscle memory that was being deliberately revealed, rather than skills that were being newly acquired. Her tactical decision-making during exercises began incorporating variables that weren't taught in the Academy's curriculum, and her physical conditioning improved at rates that defied normal human adaptation to training stress. But it was her behavior during off hours that provided the most telling indicators of her true nature. While other students socialized in groups, shared stories of their previous careers, and formed the informal bonds that typically developed among people enduring challenging training together, Maria remained pleasantly distant from personal relationships. She was helpful when asked, supportive during difficult exercises, and universally respected for her quiet competence, but she never volunteered personal information or participated in conversations that might reveal details about her background. Her living quarters in the Academy's dormitory were maintained with precision that exceeded military standards, but contained no personal photographs, mementos, or any of the small tokens that most people accumulated over the course of normal lives. The few personal items she possessed were functional rather than sentimental, and even her clothing choices suggested someone who prioritized mobility and utility over personal expression or comfort. Kane's unofficial investigation into Maria's background eventually reached levels that required him to invoke personal favors accumulated over decades of government service. The information he received came through channels so secure that it arrived without written documentation and was delivered by individuals whose identities were protected by classification levels that exceeded his normal access. What he learned changed his entire perception of the Academy's mission and Maria's role within it. The woman they knew as Maria Santos was operating under a carefully constructed identity that was maintained by intelligence agencies whose existence was acknowledged only in the most classified government briefings. Her true name was protected by security classifications that would remain in effect long after her death, and her previous assignments had taken place in locations where American involvement was officially denied by the State Department. More disturbing was the revelation that Maria's enrollment at the Academy was not a career change or personal choice, but rather part of a complex operation designed to position her for an assignment that would require the specific skills and credentials that executive protection training would provide. She was not a student seeking to learn new capabilities, but rather a professional whose expertise exceeded that of her instructors and whose presence at the Academy served purposes that extended far beyond personal development. The implications of this knowledge placed Kane in a position where his duty to the Academy's other students conflicted with obligations to national security that he had sworn to uphold decades earlier. Maria's deception was not personal fraud, but rather operational necessity that served interests Kane was not authorized to fully understand. His role as her instructor became complicated by the knowledge that he was facilitating training for someone whose true mission might involve protecting or eliminating targets whose identities were known only to individuals with security clearances that exceeded his own. But Kane's ethical dilemma was resolved by events that none of them could have predicted, and which would transform the Academy's routine training exercise into a situation where Maria's true capabilities would be revealed in circumstances that no amount of classification could conceal. The Academy's final examination was scheduled as a comprehensive practical exercise that would test every skill students had developed during their 12 weeks of training. The scenario involved protecting the high-value client during a public appearance that would include multiple security challenges, coordinated distractions, and simulated assassination attempts that required split-second tactical decisions under extreme stress. The exercise would take place at a luxury hotel in downtown Richmond, where the Academy had arranged to use public spaces and conference facilities for a realistic simulation that included civilian foot traffic, media presence, and all the complications that characterized actual protection assignments. Students would work in teams responsible for different aspects of the client's security, from advanced reconnaissance to close personal protection, and their performance would determine not only their graduation status, but also their placement with prestigious security firms that recruited directly from the Academy's graduating classes. Maria had been assigned to the close protection team, a decision that Kane had made based on her improved performance rather than his knowledge of her true background. Her teammates included Thornton and 2 other students whose background suggested they were well suited for the high-stress requirements of executive protection work, and their preparation for the exercise had been thorough and professional. What none of them knew was that the exercise had attracted attention from organizations whose interest in the Academy's training methods extended beyond academic curiosity. The hotel's security systems had been quietly modified by technicians whose credentials appeared legitimate, but whose actual affiliations would have alarmed the Academy's administrative staff if anyone had thought to verify their backgrounds more thoroughly. The client being protected during the exercise was Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, a prominent international relations expert whose public appearances typically attracted protesters, journalists, and the occasional individual whose interest in her work crossed lines that concerned professional security providers. Dr. Hartwell's agreement to participate in the Academy's training exercise had been arranged through academic connections, and her role was supposed to involve nothing more challenging than delivering a brief lecture while students practiced their protection techniques around her. But Dr. Hartwell's academic work included research into international criminal networks that had attracted attention from organizations with substantial financial interests in ensuring that certain information never reached public awareness. Her participation in what was supposed to be a routine training exercise had been noted by individuals whose responses to such developments typically involved solutions that were both permanent and untraceable. The morning of the exercise began with briefings that seemed routine and professional, though Kane noticed subtle irregularities that triggered instincts honed during years of government service in situations where attention to detail had meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. The hotel's security staff included several individuals whose backgrounds and behavior patterns seemed inconsistent with typical hospitality industry personnel, and the media representatives covering the exercise included photographers whose equipment and positioning suggested interests that extended beyond documenting student training activities. Most concerning were the modifications to the hotel's security systems that had been described as necessary upgrades for the training exercise, but which had been implemented by technicians whose work created vulnerabilities rather than enhanced protection. The surveillance cameras had been repositioned in ways that created blind spots in critical areas, and the access controls for restricted floors had been modified with overrides that weren't documented in the hotel's standard security procedures. Kane's attempts to address these concerns through normal channels were met with assurances that all modifications had been properly authorized and coordinated with Academy leadership, but the individuals providing these assurances were not people he recognized from previous exercises, and their explanations contained technical details that didn't align with his understanding of the hotel's security infrastructure. As the exercise commenced with Dr. Hartwell's arrival at the hotel, Maria's behavior underwent another subtle transformation that Kane observed with growing unease. Her positioning relative to the client and her teammates suggested tactical awareness that incorporated threats and variables that weren't part of the planned exercise, and her communication with other team members included coded phrases that weren't taught in the Academy's standard protocols. Most tellingly, Maria's attention was focused on aspects of the environment that had nothing to do with the simulated threats that students were supposed to be managing. She was watching hotel staff members whose behavior patterns suggested coordination rather than independent work assignments, tracking the movements of media personnel whose equipment and positioning indicated capabilities that exceeded normal journalism requirements, and monitoring the access points and evacuation routes with intensity that suggested she was expecting developments that weren't part of the planned scenario. The transition from training exercise to actual emergency occurred so gradually that most of the students initially failed to recognize that the situation had changed. Dr. Hartwell's lecture proceeded normally for the first 20 minutes, with students executing their protection duties with competence that would have satisfied the Academy's standards for successful graduation. The audience included the expected mix of hotel guests, academic colleagues, and media representatives, and the atmosphere was relaxed and professional. The first indication that something was wrong came from Maria's sudden shift in positioning, as she moved from her assigned location to a position that provided better oversight of the room's main entrance, while maintaining visual contact with Dr. Hartwell. Her movement was subtle enough that her teammates initially attributed it to standard tactical adjustment, but Kane recognized it as a response to threat assessment that went beyond the exercise's planned parameters. Within minutes, Maria's tactical instincts were validated by developments that transformed the hotel lobby into an active threat environment where the distinction between simulation and reality became irrelevant. The individuals Kane had identified as suspicious hotel staff members revealed themselves as part of a coordinated assault team whose equipment and training suggested professional military or intelligence backgrounds, and their objective was clearly Dr. Hartwell's elimination rather than capture. The attack commenced with sophisticated electronic warfare that disabled the hotel's communication systems, including the radios that the academy students were using to coordinate their protection duties. Emergency lighting systems failed simultaneously, creating chaos and confusion that would have provided ideal cover for an assassination attempt against a target whose security detail was composed primarily of inexperienced students still learning their craft. But Maria Santos had been preparing for exactly this kind of situation throughout her entire adult life, and her response to the crisis revealed training and experience that exceeded anything the Academy's curriculum could have provided. Her transformation from quiet student to tactical operator was so complete that it seemed like she had been replaced by an entirely different person, whose capabilities had been carefully concealed until circumstances made concealment impossible. Her first actions were designed to protect Dr. Hartwell and coordinate her teammates' response to threats they had never been trained to handle. But her tactical decisions incorporated elements that suggested she had been expecting this specific attack and had prepared countermeasures that would neutralize threats her teammates couldn't even identify. She moved with efficiency that eliminated wasted motion and positioned herself and Dr. Hartwell in areas of the hotel that provided maximum protection while maintaining options for evacuation or counterattack as circumstances required. The coordination between Maria and her teammates became a masterclass in tactical leadership as she guided Thornton and the others through a crisis that would have challenged experienced professionals. Her instructions were clear and specific. Her tactical assessment incorporated variables that weren't visible to less experienced operators, and her calm demeanor provided stability that prevented panic from compromising their defensive capabilities. But it was Maria's individual combat skills that provided the most dramatic revelation of her true capabilities. When the assault team's advance brought them into direct contact with the student protection detail, Maria's response was so swift and decisive that several of the attackers were neutralized before they fully understood what they were facing. Her hand-to-hand combat techniques incorporated elements from multiple martial arts disciplines, and her weapon handling demonstrated proficiency that could only have been developed through years of training at the highest levels of military or intelligence operations. The most remarkable aspect of Maria's performance during the crisis was not her technical expertise, but rather her tactical judgment in determining which threats required lethal force and which could be neutralized through less permanent means. Her decisions were made in split seconds under extreme stress, but her choices reflected moral and ethical considerations that suggested training in environments where such decisions had consequences that extended far beyond immediate tactical success. When the immediate threat had been neutralized and Dr. Hartwell was secure, Maria's attention turned to managing the aftermath of an incident that had transformed a routine training exercise into a classified operation with implications that reached the highest levels of national security. Her coordination with responding law enforcement agencies suggested familiarity with protocols that weren't taught in civilian security training, and her handling of media inquiries demonstrated expertise in information management that protected both Dr. Hartwell's safety and the classified aspects of the incident. Kane's role during the crisis had been limited to supporting Maria's leadership and ensuring that other students followed her instructions, but his observations of her performance provided confirmation of suspicions that had been building throughout her time at the academy. Maria Santos was not a career-changing civilian seeking new opportunities, but rather a professional operative whose skills exceeded those of most instructors at the academy. and whose presence at the training facility had been arranged to position her for exactly the kind of situation they had just survived. The official investigation of the incident would eventually reveal that Dr. Hartwell's academic research had identified criminal networks whose exposure would have cost certain organizations billions of dollars in illicit profits, and that her elimination had been contracted to professionals whose failure would have severe consequences for their employers. The attack on the Academy's training exercise had been planned as a perfect cover for an assassination that would have appeared to result from random violence rather than targeted elimination. But what the investigation could not reveal, due to classification levels that exceeded normal law enforcement access, was that Maria's enrollment at the Academy had been part of a complex operation designed to identify and neutralize exactly this kind of threat to Dr. Hartwell's safety. Her assignment had required her to maintain cover as a struggling student, while positioning herself to respond to assassination attempts that intelligence agencies had been tracking for months. The transformation in how Maria was perceived by her classmates and instructors was immediate and profound. Where she had once been seen as an unlikely candidate for executive protection work, she was now recognized as someone whose capabilities exceeded anything the Academy's training could have provided. Her quiet demeanor and unassuming appearance were now understood as operational assets rather than indicators of inadequate preparation, and her true identity became a subject of speculation. That would continue long after her graduation from the program. But Maria's response to this newfound recognition was characteristic of her entire approach to the Academy experience. She deflected personal praise and focused attention on the collaborative nature of their successful defense of Dr. Hartwell, emphasizing the contributions of her teammates and the importance of training that prepared security professionals for unexpected developments. Her humility in victory was as remarkable as her competence under pressure, and it reinforced the respect that her performance had earned from everyone who had witnessed her transformation from struggling student to elite operator. Dr. Hartwell's gratitude was expressed through academic channels that provided scholarships and research opportunities for students who had participated in her protection. But her private communications with Maria suggested recognition that their brief association had involved levels of professional competence that extended far beyond civilian security training. The criminal organizations that had targeted her elimination would eventually abandon their efforts, though the reasons for their decision would remain classified at levels that protected both Dr. Hartwell's continued safety and the operational methods that had been used to secure it. Kane's final evaluation of Maria's performance at the Academy noted her exceptional tactical skills and leadership capabilities, but the official documentation was carefully written to avoid details that might compromise the classified aspects of her true identity or mission. Her placement after graduation would be arranged through channels that provided appropriate utilization of her capabilities while maintaining the operational security that protected both her identity and ongoing intelligence operations. The Academy's reputation was enhanced by the successful defense of Dr. Hartwell, though the official accounts of the incident were modified to protect classified information and ensure that future students would not be exposed to the same kind of risks that had transformed a training exercise into an actual combat situation. The facility's security protocols were updated to address vulnerabilities that had been exploited during the attack, and the screening procedures for guest participants were modified to ensure that similar incidents could be prevented or, if necessary, managed more effectively. Maria's legacy at the Academy would be remembered not only for her individual achievements, but also for the example she provided of how true professionals handled themselves when faced with situations that tested every aspect of their training and character. Her quiet competence, tactical excellence, and moral courage had saved lives and demonstrated the highest standards of the executive protection profession, and her influence on future students would continue through the stories and lessons that instructors would share for years to come. But perhaps most importantly, Maria Santos had proven that the most dangerous opponents were often those who appeared least threatening, that true expertise was sometimes concealed rather than displayed, and that the greatest victories were achieved by those who understood that protecting others was more important than personal recognition or glory. Her compass through the crisis had been internal rather than external, guided by principles that placed duty and service above personal safety or professional advancement. The crimson dawn broke over the Virginia countryside as Maria Santos stood silently on the Academy's observation deck, her reflection ghost-like against the bulletproof glass that overlooked the training grounds, where her fellow students were beginning their morning conditioning routine. 3 weeks had passed since the incident at the Richmond Hotel, and the reverberations from that night continued to reshape the dynamics at Meridian in ways both subtle and profound. Her transformation from struggling amateur to tactical operator had been witnessed by too many people to dismiss as luck or adrenaline, yet the official reports filed with local authorities had been sanitized to protect classified information that could compromise ongoing operations. The Academy's administration had implemented new security protocols that reflected hard lessons learned from an exercise that had nearly resulted in the assassination of a protected client, though the specific details of those improvements were restricted to personnel with appropriate clearances. Kane found himself walking a careful line between his responsibilities as an instructor and his obligations to maintain operational security that protected not only Maria's true identity but also the intelligence operations that had positioned her at the Academy for purposes that extended far beyond personal career development. Maria's daily routine remained unchanged despite her elevated status among students and faculty who had witnessed her capabilities under actual combat conditions. She continued to arrive first for morning conditioning, maintained her equipment with the same meticulous attention to detail that had characterized her entire time at the Academy, and participated in training exercises with the quiet competence that had initially been mistaken for mediocrity rather than careful concealment of professional expertise. But the quality of her interactions with classmates had evolved in ways that reflected their new understanding of her true capabilities. Thornton, whose own combat experience had taught him to recognize genuine expertise when he encountered it, had become something approaching a confidant, though their conversations remained carefully bounded by operational security considerations that neither of them discussed explicitly. His respect for Maria's tactical skills was matched by his curiosity about training methods that had produced capabilities he had never encountered during his military service. The other students approached Maria with a mixture of admiration and wariness that reflected their struggle to reconcile her unassuming appearance with memories of watching her neutralize professional assassins with efficiency that had seemed almost supernatural. Her advice during training exercises was sought and followed with attention that bordered on reverence, yet she remained personally distant in ways that prevented the formation of relationships that might compromise the carefully constructed identity she maintained. Kane's own relationship with Maria had become increasingly complex as his unofficial investigation into her background had revealed information that placed their instructor-student dynamic in an entirely different context. His clearance levels provided access to intelligence summaries that confirmed his suspicions about her true identity, though the specific details of her previous assignments remained classified at levels that exceeded his authorization. What he had learned was sufficient to understand that Maria Santos represented capabilities that were typically deployed only in situations where national security interests were at stake. The psychological evaluation protocols that were standard for all Academy students had been quietly modified in Maria's case to avoid assessments that might reveal inconsistencies with her cover identity, though the modifications themselves had been implemented through channels that operated outside normal administrative procedures. Her personnel file now contained notations that would prevent routine background checks from accessing information that could compromise ongoing operations, and her academic records had been adjusted to reflect performance levels that were consistent with her public persona rather than her actual capabilities. But maintaining Maria's cover had become increasingly challenging as her reputation spread beyond the Academy's immediate community to include security professionals and government agencies, whose interest in exceptional talent operated through networks that transcended normal hiring procedures. Job offers had begun arriving through intermediaries whose credentials suggested connections to organizations that recruited personnel for assignments requiring capabilities that exceeded civilian security requirements. Kane recognized the pattern from his own experience with government service, where individuals with exceptional skills were often identified and recruited through seemingly routine interactions that were actually sophisticated assessment processes designed to evaluate suitability for classified assignments. Maria's performance at the Academy had attracted attention from recruiters whose actual employers remained concealed behind layers of corporate entities and consulting firms that served as cover for intelligence operations. The Academy's final month of training traditionally included advanced exercises that tested students' ability to adapt their skills to increasingly complex scenarios that simulated the challenges they would face in actual protection assignments. These exercises incorporated elements of surveillance detection, threat assessment, emergency medical response, and crisis management that required not only technical competence, but also the judgment and decision-making capabilities that distinguished professional operators from merely well-trained technicians. Maria's performance during these advanced exercises provided further confirmation of training and experience that exceeded anything the Academy's curriculum could have provided, though her approach to each challenge was carefully calibrated to reveal competence without exposing capabilities that might compromise her operational security. She demonstrated tactical awareness that incorporated variables beyond the scope of standard protection protocols, yet her solutions remained within the boundaries of techniques that could plausibly have been developed through exceptional natural talent rather than years of classified training. Her weapons handling had evolved from the mechanical precision that had characterized her early weeks at the Academy to flowing efficiency that suggested muscle memory developed through extensive practice under stress conditions that went far beyond standard range training. Her marksmanship scores consistently ranked among the top performers in her class, yet her technique incorporated elements that were taught only in specialized military and intelligence programs whose existence was acknowledged only through classified channels. Most remarkably, Maria's tactical decision-making during complex scenarios demonstrated understanding of threat assessment and risk management that reflected experience with actual life-or-death situations, where failure would have had consequences extending far beyond personal safety. Her choices consistently prioritized client protection, while maintaining awareness of secondary objectives and exit strategies that weren't part of the Academy's standard training methodology. But it was during the Academy's capstone exercise that Maria's true nature would be revealed in circumstances that would transform her carefully maintained cover into operational necessity, and demonstrate capabilities that would leave no doubt about her actual identity and purpose at the Academy. The exercise was designed as a comprehensive field test that would evaluate every aspect of students' training in a scenario that incorporated elements from multiple protection disciplines while testing their ability to adapt to unexpected developments. Under realistic stress conditions, students would be responsible for protecting a simulated high-value target during a multi-day assignment that included public appearances, private meetings, transportation security, and accommodation arrangements that reflected the complexity of actual executive protection work. The scenario location was a resort conference center in the Blue Ridge Mountains, where the Academy had arranged to conduct the exercise using facilities that provided both realistic operational environments and controlled conditions that ensured student safety while maintaining the authenticity necessary for meaningful evaluation. The protected client would be portrayed by a retired ambassador whose experience with actual protection details would provide realistic interactions and feedback that would enhance the training value of the exercise. What none of the students knew was that the resort had been selected for reasons that extended beyond its suitability as a training location, and that the ambassador's participation in the exercise had been arranged through channels that served intelligence objectives rather than purely educational purposes. The facility's remote location and sophisticated security infrastructure made it ideal for operations that required isolation from potential surveillance or interference, and its guest accommodations could house personnel whose presence needed to remain unacknowledged by normal resort operations. Maria's assignment to the close protection team for the exercise had been arranged through processes that appeared routine but were actually designed to position her where her capabilities could be utilized most effectively if circumstances required. Operational deployment rather than merely training evaluation. Her teammates included students whose backgrounds and capabilities complemented her skills while providing cover for activities that might exceed normal academy training parameters. The days leading up to the exercise had included briefings and preparation activities that seemed consistent with standard academy procedures, though Kane had noticed communications and coordination activities that suggested involvement by organizations whose participation in training exercises typically indicated interests beyond academic evaluation. The resort's security preparations had been enhanced through modifications that exceeded normal requirements for student training, and the personnel assigned to support the exercise included individuals whose qualifications suggested experience with classified operations. Most concerning to Kane was the presence of observers whose credentials indicated affiliation with government agencies whose interest in academy training typically reflected recruitment objectives rather than educational oversight. These individuals maintained careful distance from student activities while positioning themselves to evaluate performance levels and capabilities that might indicate suitability for assignments requiring security clearances and operational expertise that exceeded civilian requirements. The exercise commenced with arrival procedures that tested students' ability to secure a location and establish protective protocols in an environment where they had limited advance intelligence and no control over potential security vulnerabilities. The resort's sprawling architecture and extensive grounds provided numerous challenges for perimeter security and access control, while its normal operations continued around the student activities in ways that created realistic complications for threat assessment and client protection. Maria's initial actions during the arrival phase demonstrated tactical awareness that incorporated considerations beyond the scope of standard protection protocols, as she identified potential surveillance positions, escape routes, and defensive positions that would provide advantages if the exercise scenario developed beyond its planned parameters. Her coordination with teammates reflected understanding of team dynamics and communication procedures that were taught only in advanced military and intelligence training programs. The first day of the exercise proceeded according to the planned scenario, with students demonstrating competence in establishing security protocols, coordinating with resort personnel, and managing the protected client's schedule while maintaining situational awareness that would detect potential threats before they could develop into actual dangers. The ambassador played his role with authenticity that provided realistic feedback and challenges while testing students' ability to balance security requirements with client satisfaction and operational efficiency. But Kane's growing unease was validated by developments that suggested the exercise was serving purposes beyond student evaluation, as communications intercepts and surveillance indicators pointed to interest from organizations whose attention typically reflected intelligence objectives rather than academic assessment. The resort's isolation was being exploited by parties whose identity and purpose remained concealed, though their capabilities and methods suggested professional intelligence operations rather than routine training observation. The transition from training exercise to operational deployment occurred during the second night when electronic surveillance detected unauthorized personnel conducting reconnaissance of the resort security perimeter using equipment and techniques that indicated professional intelligence capabilities rather than casual curiosity. The intrusion was sophisticated enough to avoid detection by the resort's standard security systems, and the intruders' objectives appeared to focus on the areas where Academy students were conducting their training exercise. Kane's response to these developments was guided by protocols that had been established through channels operating outside normal Academy administration, as his role in protecting Maria's operational security required coordination with intelligence agencies whose involvement in Academy operations was not acknowledged through official channels. His communications with these agencies confirmed that the unauthorized surveillance represented potential compromise of an ongoing operation, whose success required maintaining Maria's cover while protecting the ambassador from threats that extended beyond the exercise scenario. But the most critical intelligence came from sources whose access to classified information revealed that the ambassador's participation in the Academy exercise had been arranged specifically to provide cover for a meeting with intelligence assets whose exposure would compromise operations in multiple countries. The resort's isolation and the Academy's training activities provided perfect concealment for contacts that needed to remain unacknowledged by official channels, while Maria's presence ensured that security capabilities would be available if circumstances required protection beyond what standard training exercises could provide. The realization that their training exercise had been transformed into cover for actual intelligence operations placed all of the students in potential danger, though only Maria possessed the clearance levels and operational experience necessary to understand the full implications of their situation. Kane's attempts to extract the students from what had become an active operation were blocked by authorities whose priorities focused on completing the intelligence mission rather than protecting Academy personnel who had been placed at risk without their knowledge or consent. Maria's response to learning about the true nature of their situation was characteristic of her approach to all challenges she had faced during her time at the Academy, as she accepted responsibility for protecting her teammates while adapting to circumstances that required capabilities beyond anything they had been trained to handle. Her tactical assessment of their situation incorporated threat analysis that reflected understanding of intelligence operations and counterintelligence methods that were classified far above the clearance levels of her fellow students. The decision to maintain the facade of continuing the training exercise while actually implementing protective measures for a classified intelligence operation required Maria to reveal aspects of her true capabilities while maintaining operational security that protected both her identity and the ongoing mission. Her teammates would need to follow her leadership without understanding the full context of their situation, trusting her judgment in circumstances where conventional Academy training provided inadequate guidance for the challenges they would face. The transformation in Maria's demeanor and approach was subtle, but unmistakable to those who had learned to recognize the indicators of her true expertise, as she shifted from the careful concealment that had characterized her Academy experience to tactical leadership that reflected years of experience in classified operations where failure meant consequences extending far beyond personal danger. Her instructions to teammates were specific and precise, incorporating contingencies and alternatives that reflected understanding of threat scenarios that weren't covered in civilian protection training. Thornton's response to Maria's assumption of operational command was immediate acceptance based on respect earned through previous demonstrations of her capabilities, though his limited understanding of their actual situation left him dependent on her judgment in ways that would have been dangerous if her expertise had been anything less than genuine. His military background provided context for recognizing that their exercise had been compromised by developments requiring capabilities that exceeded normal training parameters, and his trust in Maria's leadership reflected confidence earned through careful observation of her skills and judgment. The other students adapted to the changing dynamics with varying degrees of understanding and acceptance, though their respect for Maria's demonstrated competence provided sufficient motivation for following her instructions, even when those instructions seemed to exceed the parameters of their training exercise. Their lack of clearance for understanding the true nature of their situation required Maria to provide leadership while protecting them from information that could compromise both their safety and ongoing operations. Kane's role during this transition was limited to providing support for Maria's operational decisions, while maintaining communications with intelligence agencies whose oversight of the situation operated through channels that bypassed normal academy administration. His understanding of the classified aspects of their situation was sufficient to recognize that Maria's capabilities exceeded anything academy training could have provided, and that her presence at the academy had been arranged specifically to position her for the kind of operation they were now supporting. The resort's security infrastructure was quietly enhanced through modifications that provided capabilities for detecting and responding to threats that exceeded the parameters of normal hospitality industry requirements, though these enhancements were implemented through methods that maintained the appearance of routine maintenance and upgrade activities. The personnel responsible for these modifications possessed clearances and expertise that indicated affiliation with intelligence agencies, whose involvement in resort operations would remain unacknowledged through official channels. Most critically, the ambassador's schedule was modified to incorporate security protocols that reflected the actual threat environment rather than the simulated scenarios that had been planned for the training exercise, though these modifications were implemented in ways that maintained the appearance of continuing the Academy's educational activities. His meetings with intelligence assets would proceed under the protection of capabilities that far exceeded what Academy students could have provided, though the students themselves would continue to participate in what they believed was an advanced training exercise. The intelligence assets whose protection required Maria's capabilities were individuals whose exposure would compromise operations that had been years in development, and whose safety represented national security interests that extended far beyond the immediate situation at the resort. Their identities were protected by classification levels that exceeded the clearance of most government officials, and their intelligence value was sufficient to justify the complex operation that had placed Maria at the Academy and positioned her to provide protection when circumstances required capabilities beyond what normal security arrangements could offer. But the most dangerous aspect of their situation was the presence of hostile intelligence operatives, whose mission was to identify and eliminate the assets who were meeting with the ambassador, and whose capabilities included surveillance and elimination methods that would challenge even Maria's exceptional skills. These operatives had been tracking the intelligence operation for months, and their presence at the resort represented the culmination of counterintelligence efforts that had been designed to neutralize American intelligence capabilities in regions where strategic interests were at stake. The detection of hostile surveillance had triggered protocols that would normally have resulted in cancellation of the intelligence meeting and evacuation of all personnel to secure locations where their safety could be guaranteed through conventional security measures. But the intelligence being exchanged was sufficiently critical to national security that the operation would proceed despite the risks, with Maria's capabilities providing the margin of safety that would allow the mission to be completed while protecting the assets whose lives were at stake. Maria's tactical assessment of the threat environment incorporated understanding of hostile capabilities and methods that reflected experience with similar operations where American intelligence assets had been targeted by foreign services whose resources and expertise posed serious challenges to conventional protection methods. Her defensive planning would need to account for threats that included surveillance penetration, electronic warfare capabilities, and elimination techniques that could bypass normal security measures through methods that were designed specifically to defeat American protection protocols. The coordination between Maria and the intelligence assets required careful balance between operational security and protection effectiveness, as her role needed to remain concealed while providing capabilities that would ensure mission success. And asset safety. Her instructions to teammates would need to accomplish protective objectives without revealing the classified nature of their actual assignment, requiring tactical leadership that achieved mission objectives while maintaining cover that protected ongoing operations. Thornton's military experience provided context for recognizing that their situation had evolved beyond normal training parameters, though his limited clearance prevented him from understanding the specific nature of the threats they were facing, or the strategic importance of the mission they were supporting. His trust in Maria's leadership was based on demonstrated competence rather than full understanding of their circumstances, requiring him to execute tactical assignments that served objectives he wasn't authorized to comprehend fully. The resort's isolation, which had initially been selected as an advantage for conducting secure intelligence operations, now represented a tactical disadvantage as hostile operatives could exploit the limited access routes and communication options to implement surveillance and attack plans that would be more difficult to execute in urban environments with multiple escape routes and law enforcement resources. Maria's defensive planning would need to account for these geographical constraints, while maximizing the advantages that the resort's security infrastructure could provide. The Academy's training equipment and resources, which had been brought to the resort to support the exercise, were quietly supplemented with capabilities that reflected the actual threat environment rather than simulated training scenarios, though these enhancements were implemented through methods that maintained the appearance of standard educational activities. The weapons and communication systems available to the students were upgraded to operational specifications that would provide effectiveness against threats that exceeded Academy training parameters. Kane's communications with intelligence oversight. Agencies confirmed that Maria's cover identity would be maintained even if circumstances required her to demonstrate capabilities that exceeded normal Academy training, as her long-term operational value required protecting her true identity, even at the cost of revealing exceptional skills that might raise questions about her background. The balance between operational effectiveness and security protection would be managed through post-incident documentation that would attribute her performance to exceptional natural talent rather than classified training. But the most complex aspect of the situation was the need to protect the other students from understanding the true nature of their circumstances while utilizing their capabilities to support an operation whose success was critical to national security interests. Their participation would be managed through tactical assignments that served protective objectives while maintaining the facade of continuing their training exercise, requiring leadership skills that could coordinate complex operations while preserving operational security. The intelligence assets whose protection was the true objective of the operation possessed information that would reshape American understanding of hostile capabilities in regions where strategic interests required accurate intelligence for policy decisions that could affect global stability. Their safety represented investments of years of careful development and positioning, and their loss would compromise intelligence operations that extended far beyond the immediate situation at the resort. The hostile operatives whose mission was to eliminate these assets represented capabilities that had been specifically developed to defeat American protection methods, and their presence at the resort indicated strategic planning that had anticipated the possibility of intelligence meetings requiring exceptional security measures. Their elimination methods would be designed to appear accidental or unrelated to intelligence operations, requiring defensive measures that could detect and counter threats that were specifically engineered to bypass conventional protection protocols. Maria's preparation for defending against these threats incorporated tactical options that reflected training in specialized techniques that were classified at levels exceeding normal military or law enforcement access, as her mission required. Capabilities that could counter adversaries whose expertise had been developed specifically to defeat American intelligence operations. Her defensive planning would utilize resort infrastructure and academy resources in ways that maximized protective effectiveness while maintaining operational security that protected classified methods and capabilities. The timing of the hostile operation had been calculated to exploit the presence of academy students whose limited experience and capabilities would normally have provided inadequate protection for high-value intelligence assets, though the planners had not anticipated that one of those students possessed operational expertise that exceeded their assessment of American defensive capabilities. Maria's presence represented a variable that would disrupt hostile planning, while providing protection that would ensure mission success despite the sophisticated threats they were facing. As the night deepened and surveillance indicators confirmed that hostile operatives were positioning themselves for operations that would commence with the dawn, Maria's transformation from academy student to operational asset would be tested in circumstances that would reveal the full extent of her capabilities. While determining whether American intelligence objectives could be achieved despite the presence of adversaries whose elimination methods represented the most sophisticated threats that foreign intelligence services could deploy. The first shot shattered the pre-dawn silence at exactly 4:47 a.m., its suppressed report barely audible above the mountain wind that whispered through the resort's pine groves. Maria's eyes snapped open in her dormitory room, her trained senses immediately distinguishing between the sound of a weapon's discharge and the normal nocturnal sounds of the wilderness surrounding their location. Within seconds, she was moving with fluid precision that reflected years of conditioning for exactly this kind of emergency response. Her teammates stirred gradually as Maria's urgent but controlled voice cut through their sleep, issuing instructions that transformed their comfortable accommodations into a tactical staging area where every movement served defensive purposes. Thornton's military background enabled him to process her directives without requiring detailed explanations, while the other students responded with trust, earned through previous demonstrations of her capabilities under crisis conditions. The ambassador's security detail had been eliminated with surgical precision that spoke to planning and execution capabilities far exceeding typical criminal threats, and the hostile operatives were now moving through the resort's corridors with confidence that suggested intimate knowledge of the facility's layout and security weaknesses. Their objective was the intelligence assets whose identities had been protected through layers of operational security that were now being systematically penetrated by adversaries whose capabilities had been specifically developed to defeat American protection methods. Maria's tactical assessment of their situation was completed in minutes, her mind processing threat vectors and defensive options with efficiency that reflected training designed for operations where hesitation measured in seconds could determine mission success or catastrophic failure. The resort's isolation, which had been selected to provide security for the intelligence meeting, now worked against them by limiting evacuation options and external support resources that could have provided overwhelming advantages against hostile forces. Her coordination with Kane was conducted through secure communication protocols that bypassed the resort's compromised infrastructure, as their defensive planning required information sharing that exceeded normal academy training parameters while maintaining operational security that protected classified methods and capabilities. Kane's role had evolved from instructor to tactical coordinator, his experience with government operations providing context for Maria's requirements while supporting decisions that would determine whether American intelligence objectives could be achieved despite sophisticated opposition. The intelligence assets, whose protection was their primary mission, had been moved to secure locations within the resort structure, where defensive advantages could be maximized while maintaining communication capabilities that would allow the intelligence exchange to proceed even under combat conditions. Their safety represented years of careful development and strategic positioning, and their loss would compromise operations that extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Maria's defensive preparations incorporated every resource available through academy equipment and resort infrastructure, transforming training materials into operational tools, while positioning her teammates in roles that maximized their capabilities. Despite limited understanding of the true nature of their mission, her leadership during these preparations demonstrated tactical expertise that seemed almost supernatural in its anticipation of hostile movements and countermeasures. The hostile operatives' advance through the resort was conducted with professional discipline that reflected extensive training in elimination techniques designed specifically to defeat American protection protocols, though their tactical assumptions had not accounted for resistance capabilities that exceeded their assessment of Academy student competence. Maria's defensive positions were established using terrain advantages and structural features that provided overlapping fields of fire, while maintaining escape routes that could be utilized if circumstances required tactical withdrawal. When the confrontation commenced with coordinated assault waves designed to overwhelm student defenses through superior numbers and professional expertise, Maria's response revealed capabilities that transformed the tactical situation from potential massacre to defensive engagement where American advantages could be brought to bear effectively. Her weapon handling displayed muscle memory developed through years of training under stress conditions that had prepared her for exactly this kind of combat scenario. Her teammates' performance exceeded their own expectations as Maria's tactical coordination enabled them to utilize their academy training in ways that multiplied their effectiveness while compensating for their limited experience with actual combat operations. Thornton's military background provided crucial support for Maria's tactical decisions, while the other students demonstrated courage and competence that validated their selection for academy training, despite their lack of preparation for the lethal realities they now faced. The elimination of hostile operatives proceeded with efficiency that reflected Maria's understanding of combat tactics and weapons employment, though her decisions regarding lethal force were guided by moral and ethical considerations that distinguished professional operators from mere killers. Her tactical choices consistently prioritized protection of her teammates and the intelligence assets while minimizing casualties among adversaries whose elimination was necessary for mission success. The intelligence exchange proceeded under combat conditions that tested every aspect of protective capabilities while demonstrating that American assets could operate effectively even when facing adversaries whose planning and capabilities represented sophisticated threats to national security interests. The information transferred during these meetings would reshape understanding of hostile capabilities in regions where accurate intelligence was essential for policy decisions affecting global stability. As dawn broke over the Blue Ridge Mountains, the resort's grounds bore evidence of a confrontation that had tested the finest capabilities both sides could deploy, though the official records would be classified at levels that protected operational methods and intelligence sources whose exposure could compromise ongoing operations. Maria's performance had ensured mission success, while protecting lives that represented both personal commitments and strategic assets whose value extended far beyond immediate tactical considerations. Kane's final evaluation of the situation would note the exceptional capabilities demonstrated by Academy students under circumstances that had challenged their training and character, though his documentation would be carefully written to protect classified information while accurately reflecting performance levels that exceeded normal expectations for civilian security personnel. The Academy's reputation would be enhanced by successful completion of protective duties under combat conditions, though the full details of their achievement would remain known only to those with appropriate clearances. Maria's transformation. During the crisis had revealed capabilities that left no doubt about her true identity and purpose at the Academy. Yet her response to successful mission completion was characteristic of her entire approach to exceptional circumstances. She deflected personal recognition while emphasizing collaborative nature of their success, focusing attention on the courage and competence of teammates whose contributions had been essential for achieving objectives that none of them had been prepared to understand fully. The intelligence assets his protection had been their primary mission expressed gratitude through channels that would provide career opportunities and recognition, appropriate for individuals who had demonstrated exceptional service under conditions that tested every aspect of their training and character. Their safety had been purchased through courage and competence that validated the Academy's training methods while demonstrating capabilities that exceeded normal civilian security requirements. The hostile operatives whose elimination had been necessary for mission success represented capabilities that had been specifically developed to challenge American intelligence operations, and their defeat demonstrated that protective methods and personnel training continued to provide advantages despite sophisticated opposition. The tactical lessons learned from this engagement would enhance future operations, while protecting methods and capabilities that served ongoing national security interests. Maria's placement after Academy graduation would be arranged through channels that provided appropriate utilization of her revealed capabilities, while maintaining operational security that protected both her true identity and the intelligence operations that had positioned her for assignment where her skills could serve national interests. Her Academy experience had provided perfect cover for positioning exceptional capabilities, where they could be deployed when circumstances required protection that exceeded normal security arrangements. The Academy's final ceremony honored all students who had completed training under circumstances that challenged their preparation and character, though the specific details of their achievement would remain classified to protect intelligence operations and methods whose exposure could compromise ongoing national security activities. Maria's quiet competence and tactical excellence had saved lives, while demonstrating the highest standards of protective service, ensuring that her influence on future students would continue through lessons and examples that instructors would share for generations. Her legacy would be remembered not only for individual achievements under combat conditions, but also for leadership that had enabled others to exceed their perceived limitations while serving purposes that extended far beyond personal recognition or advancement. The compass that had guided her through crisis had been internal rather than external, directed by principles that placed duty and service above personal safety while achieving objectives that served interests larger than any individual contribution. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.